Hello everyone, here we are. Where else would we be except here? I always say that. I have stories today, more stories. What I'm really doing is snowing you guys with stories and stories, examples and examples. But the general theme of them all is the same. And I don't know how else to teach this except to give instances of what I'm talking about. I've got written up here inside the circle at the bottom of the top board, symbols of subjective truth. The idea that we can look at what a person says, believes, claims, and imposes upon us, not only from the standpoint of evaluating whether it agrees with what other people say is true of the external world, but instead looking for the truth that it might symbolize at the deepest level of what that person's world is all about. So my examples are to do with that. So let me just go launching right into them again. This is a very natural part of the phenomenological approach to do this, because following phenomenology, this is the third great boulder, okay? That's reality with a capital R. That's the idea that there is an external world, we know what it is, we have to evaluate whether a person's in contact with it. Phenomenology avoids that. It looks at what each person's world is in its own terms, with its own history, its own meanings. It's a soft kind of listening approach also that isn't oriented necessarily to the literal level. It hears things at symbolic levels and tries to grasp all the possible levels in deciding what something means that someone is saying to you is true. Let me give you another story that illustrates it still again, but I've given you a bunch already. Here we go again. I have to get back into my time traveling machine and put myself back about 25 years or so to some conversations I had with a young woman. Again, one incarcerated in a state psychiatric hospital at Marlborough, now closed down. Someone I used to visit there on a bi-weekly basis. She was about 23 or 4 years old. What else do you need to know about her for me to tell this story? Not much. She'd had years of hospitalization. She carried the diagnosis, which I don't subscribe to, as you know. I'm so critical of the medical model, but her diagnosis was chronic schizophrenia. So that's a part of the picture, that she was regarded in that, from that point of view, as suffering from the greatest mental illness there is, so-called schizophrenia. What else can I tell you about her before I launch into my story? I was at the beginning of our work. I had gone down there to see her maybe 9 or 10 times or something, and I don't even remember what the content of those first 9 or 10 visits was, but I knew that it was going to be a long haul with her in any case. And so I was kind of exploring and being friendly and drinking coffee with her and enjoying the day. We would take walks outside the cottage that she was assigned to on the grounds of Marlborough. Marlborough Psychiatric Hospital was physically a very beautiful setting. It was, wonderful grass and trees and kind of nice-looking buildings. But it was a snake pit in terms of the actual treatment that one received there. The staff, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, the social workers, and so on. This is a little bit hard to explain, but they were like the bottom of the barrel. Like, who's going to work in a state psychiatric hospital for low pay? Losers, basically. So the place is packed with losers. The patients, of course, are very devastated, but I often had the experience, I remember back on those days, I'd get to know the staff real well sometimes, and they often seemed as disturbed as the patients to me. But nevertheless, I would go down there and try to put my 2 cents worth in and try to be a benign influence on a few people that I took under my wing, or tried to. It happened repeatedly that I would begin with a patient on an outpatient basis. They'd be coming to see me in my office for a time or 2 or 3 a week. But then the bottom would fall out. They weren't able to function in the community at all, and they would end up hospitalized and sent to the state hospital. But what I would do when I had time, and I had a lot of time in those days since I had no life except my work, I'd follow them into the hospital. And I would prepare the way by spending a lot of time talking to the staff there, getting myself onto the included in the professional staff of the hospital so I would have access to the patients and then continue to work with them. So one fine day, this 24-year-old woman and I were walking across the grounds of Marlborough Psychiatric Hospital. Imagine it was an afternoon. Imagine it's 2 o'clock, sun is shining, the day is warm, it's not hot. And she turned to me in the middle of our walk and she said, "You know, George." I said, "What's that?" Jane, I'll call her. There's a cavern beneath this hospital. And inside the cavern, there are assassins. And they sit there during the day, but at night they come out. And when they come out at night, in the dark, they murder the patients. That was the statement that she made to me. Okay. I'm walking along, kind of drinking my coffee, having a nice day, enjoying, and suddenly she's telling me about this cavern beneath the hospital with these assassins in it. And it produced an image in my mind of like ninja-suited, black-coated guys, something who's just sitting on these chairs like this, and at night, I didn't ask her for details. I don't really remember clearly what I said or did in being told this. How are you going to answer a thing like that is said to you? You know, something's being said. How are you going to respond? There are no books that tell you what to do. I didn't know what to do. I think what I did was just have an emotional reaction to what she had just said. I heard it very clearly, the statement, the belief, the persecution, the murders that were taking place every night, the danger therefore that she was in. I think what I said was, "Wow!" Because I wouldn't have known what else to do, but I would have wanted to say something. So I think, "Wow! Woo! Okay." She went on from there, and she said, "It's not only the hospital here at Marlborough, George. Every mental hospital in America has a cavern like this. And they have assassins in them, and they come out at night, and they strangle and they murder the patients." And so I was standing there, she's telling me this, looking into my eyes, and I didn't know what to say or what further to do. I mean, I can give her my wow, what's that going to say? But then something else began to happen. She said, "Now I have a question for you." And I said, "What's that, Jane? Do you believe what I just told you? Or am I mentally ill? Is what I just told you the truth of what's happening? Or am I sick? And this is a false idea that out of my sickness that I've dreamed up. Which is it, George? You believe me or not believe me? Am I sick or is this true?" I call this moment the Cartesian crunch. Okay, it's my invented term for what it is. And it's what that refers to, this is famous only in my own mind, and you're not responsible for it. It's not on the test. What's the Cartesian crunch? Oh my God. The crunch is the patient makes a claim as to what is the story that's taking place. That claim flies in the face of all that the clinician therapist believes is true in the world. So there's a clash between what you think is true, what is true for the therapist's reality with a small r, and what is true in the patient's mind at that moment. But the Cartesian crunch is not just the clash. The crunch is when the patient then demands to know whether he or she is being believed for what they say. How do you handle that? I'm going to tell you what happened between her and me. I did not handle this well at all. I didn't know what to say. I knew that if I said, I really think you're sick, I think you're mentally ill, I think you're schizophrenic, I'm not going to talk this way to her. I knew better than to do a thing like that. But I could imagine saying a thing like that. This is a delusion, this is not true, there are no assassins, there's no cavern, no nothing. Forget about it. That would be an attack upon her image that she's creating and embracing. And for reasons that I wasn't understanding at the time, she needs to have that. It doesn't make any sense to attack that. But how can I say that I believe it's true when I don't believe it's true? I don't think there are any assassins there, and my reality doesn't fit there. So what am I going to do? Am I going to say that, yes, I believe it, when I really don't? She'd look in my eyes and know I'm lying. So that would be no good either. I didn't know what to say. And I remember what happened. She said, which is it? Am I sick, or is this true? Am I mentally ill? Is it a delusion, or is this happening? Which is it? I want to know right now, George. You know, she'd back me up against a brick wall and was kind of pushing on me like this. Which is it? A or B? One or two? Yep, sick or true? And I remember saying to her, Jane, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that you're sick. I refuse to do that. Her answer? Not good enough! I want to know whether this is true, what I'm saying. And I didn't know what to do. I just knew not to say that she was sick. I knew not to. I was not going to agree to something I didn't believe. She'd see I was lying. I did not know what to do. And I said, I've got to get the hell out of here. I just got to get away from this woman. And she's grabbing me and banging me against this brick wall. Boom, boom. Which is it? Yes or no? Sick or true? Whatever it is. And what I recall is wrenching myself away from her and almost sprinting to my car and saying, I'll see you next time, but I got to go now. I'm sorry, my dear. I'm out of here. Goodbye. And then what I remember, I could be making this up, but I'm in my car driving down the road out of the hospital, and I think I remember her chasing after me like this with her fist. Yes or no? True or false? Sick or well? Whatever it is, okay? Oh my God. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just get the hell out of Dodge. It's the finest thing, because if you stay, you're going to do something to make the situation worse. You just know it's going to happen. It's better to just get away. And I'm a believer, just running away, but you have to come back, too. So what are we going to do when you come back? Well, what happened in this case was the following. I went home. I may have called my friend Stollerow to talk over the crisis that was going on, try to figure something else out, but I tried to do some deep thinking about what is going on here with her telling me a thing like this. These assassins are there. Before I saw her the next time, I had an encounter with a psychiatrist on the grounds of Marlborough as well. And I told him about the crisis that was taking place. Okay? She had presented this idea that there was a cavern there and that the assassins were in there and they're coming out and murdering the patients at night. And the psychiatrist said, I have a suggestion what we could do with this case. And I said, tell me, please. Any suggestion I would be very appreciative to receive. He said, let's get a backhoe. We'll hire one, have it brought in here, and we'll dig up the grounds and expose the cavern. And she'll come out here and we'll let her watch as the digging is taking place. And she'll see that there's no cavern there. And it will correct her thinking. That was the proposal. I knew that was stupid. That's not... If you think about what would happen, it's worthwhile thinking about this. I call this backhoe therapy. She makes the claim of what's underneath the surface of the ground. We'll just dig it up and see if that's really true. One of two possibilities are what comes into my mind. And I've seen people try this kind of thing, not with backhoes, but some corresponding direct contradiction of what a person claims to be the story. Let's imagine she's out there, Jane, and George is there, maybe the psychiatrist is there, and we got the backhoe, and he's digging all through a whole acre of ground, digging it up, digging it up, digging it up. Cleans up the whole thing, no cavern, no ninjas, no assassins, nothing. And Jane looks at this and, excuse me for just a moment, and goes out there into the mud and starts pawing through the mud, finds an old clipboard and some pencils and some old pieces of paper with some blurred writing on it. Ah, the evidence! Okay? In other words, if you're going to believe that the structure of ideas that you're maintaining is true, if you're going to believe that these things are true, how is that going to be disproved? The fact it could all have been concealed. They found out about the plan. The assassins vacated the premises, but they left the evidence behind. That's what it would be. Aha! Proof. Or another possibility would be that it succeeded. That, in other words, that the image she had maintained, generated, was successfully contradicted by the excavation, by the backhoe. But what would have been accomplished by that? Would she have been helped by that? No, because I think she would have incurred an injury of unknown magnitude, because her symbol that she had generated had been attacked and perhaps destroyed. This is going to hurt her, even though we have a hard time understanding that symbol. It's what she's put together that expresses a truth of her life. See, this is the idea of subjective truth. So you just wouldn't want to do a thing like that. Heavy-handed confrontations with so-called objective reality, they flow out of the doctrine of reality with a capital R, but generally what's going to happen if you do that is you're going to injure and make the patient much worse than she was before. You're ripping away what she's generated. You have nothing to take its place. So that was no good either. It's a little bit hard to explain what went on with me that turned me around on this case, but I want to see if I can do a okay description of what it was. Here's what I remember. That over the weekend, after the confrontation with her, where she's saying, sick or true, mentally ill, or is this right, all this kind of thing, I was sent an essay that one of my own former students from years before had written. Long story short there is I had a very brilliant, sensitive, lovely, gorgeous student who'd gotten an MSW after graduating from Rutgers, and then had become a clinician at Rutgers Community Mental Health Center at UMD&J, now called, but they called it just that at the time, and had worked for about 5 or 6 years as an outpatient psychotherapist there, and working primarily with very seriously disturbed people, often carrying diagnoses like schizophrenia and so on. And she had her history working in the mental health community there was one of increasing, deepening disillusionment, because the primary mode of treatment was really medication rather than psychotherapy. And she had written an essay that was a protest against what she was seeing. And the title of her essay was, "Are We Murdering a Generation of Geniuses?" She saw the severely mentally ill as potentially, at least, if not actually, geniuses who are systematically being murdered by the medical model treatment led by pharmaceutical intervention being the primary modality of the therapy there. I remember that that title really spoke to me, and I've connected it to what this patient was saying, that these assassins were coming out and murdering people at night in the hospital. And then the following sequence of thoughts ran through my mind, that maybe there's truth in what she's saying, but it's a metaphorical truth. We need to look at it symbolically, not get so literal on it all the time. There might not be ninjas that we could dig up on the grounds. Who knows? They might be there. They could be there. Now, I have a little collateral thought. Sometimes you hear claims that are made and they turn out oddly to be exactly right. I had another patient years ago who said that the CIA was following him and tracking him and taping his calls and bugging his communications and really making his life miserable. And I thought he was a standard paranoid schizophrenic. I was working medical model. This is a long time ago. I was kind of in that modality and all that. Again, to make a long story short with him, he was a tremendously upset person in a horrible crisis, but I found out it was true. Because he had been a government worker in the earlier years of his life who had had access to secret codes that could be used by the government to stop ICBMs in flight. Like if you send off ICBMs with hydrogen bombs on them to blow up Russia or something like that, there's special codes you can send to the thing to blow itself up. This guy had had access to those. And then he had flaked out, but the CIA or FBI or all these people were looking for him and tracking him and worried that he was going to betray, important government secrets. Did that mean that he was just, all his fears were completely justified? No, he was in a crisis. He was certainly well qualified for his diagnosis if one wants to place it on him. But sometimes they are persecuting you. But it kind of illustrates the principle too. Just because they're persecuting you doesn't mean you're not paranoid. You might be paranoid anyway, and they will be really doing you in. But back to Jane, the story here, okay? So I thought about this, are we murdering a generation of geniuses? And then the idea, maybe there are murders taking place, but maybe they are soul murders, emotional murders, psychological killings, rather than physical ones, if we look at it metaphorically. And I started thinking about what it's like to be someone for whom the bottom has fallen out of their world, who doesn't have any stable place to stand to even sense of what's happening, and then finds himself or herself, in this case, in an institution that declares them to be schizophrenic. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought about what it's like to be seen as schizophrenic, first of all? To have anything and everything you say and do be viewed through the diagnostic system's lens as a sign of psychopathology. You're not taken seriously. You're seen as a sick individual, and whatever you express and whatever your actions are becomes filtered into this framework of symptoms that define the illness you're thought to have. So that's one thing, but if anybody who would have the fate of being viewed that way would be upset by it. It would be disturbing and upsetting. But what about someone for whom the bottom has fallen out completely? They would be defenseless against that and might actually feel they were being killed in being viewed in that way. So that's what occurred to me. That maybe Jane, I keep calling her Anna, she's very similar to Anna in a lot of ways, so I mix the two of them up sometimes. But that's what Jane was talking about the experience of being killed off by the medical model, applied in a system to people who have no defense against it and no resources to fall back on at all. That she was symbolizing that, expressing that, concretizing it in terms of this idea that the assassins were there. Then I wondered about the idea of why do they come out at night? Why don't they come out during the day, the assassins? And the following thought ran through my mind, and this story is in Abyss of Madness. You'll see it if you look at it. The kind of manifest content of a mental health center, the daylight vision of what you're doing there, is you're helping people with their mental problems. One would think that a hospital would be a place one could get well, but sometimes there are things going on in these hospitals that are destroying the people who are there to receive help. The destructive effect is hidden. Like the destructive effect of the medical model itself is not something that's given any credit. It occurs in the dark in a certain way. So it occurred to me, and maybe she says it's happening at night because of the hiddenness of the invalidation and the nature of the soul murder that's taking place. So I decided, as I lay in my bed at home thinking about Jane, she was right. There's a cavern, the assassins are there, they're killing people every night, and she's right also that they're there all over the country. Every hospital in America has one of these. But I'm on a metaphorical level with her, but seeing that this is deeply real and that she needs it acknowledged that this is deeply real. So I decided to tell her that's it. And here's what happened. I went to see her the following Monday or Tuesday. Sure enough, she was waiting for me with more. Is it this? Is it that? A or B? One or two? Sick or true? And all that. And I told her, like, it's kind of my way of doing things when I'm in a crisis. I say, shut up. I put my finger up to their lips and I make them be quiet so I can talk. Listen to me. I have something to say to you. And I said the following. I said, Jane, I want to apologize deeply to you for something. I ran out of here last time without really answering your questions. I just jumped in my car and took off, and the problem was I didn't understand what you were saying to me at the time, and I just needed to go home. So I apologize for that. I didn't understand that although you were being exceptionally clear, I want to tell you in what you were saying to me. I was hoping that would do it. Okay, just all we have to do is say that, but no, it wasn't good enough. And I said, well, I have an answer for you now. My answer is this: yes, 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 yes. I said the word yes 4 times, okay, to her. I was hoping that would be it, too, but there's still something, she wants to hear something more. And so I decided then to say, murder is everywhere. And you're right about it not just being here at the hospital. It's taken place everywhere. It's goddamn everywhere. I understand what you were saying, and I agree with you, and the answer is yes! Okay, I didn't say anything about the assassins, the cavern. I wanted to leave the concrete details of that alone, but I wanted to sort of connect to the heart of the matter, which I thought she was talking about seeing people destroyed, including the threat of her own destruction. And what did she do with that? Well, she was like this. She'd get a little smile on her face when things would go well with us. Like, dropped it. I never heard another word about it. Just disappeared. The whole thing just closed off. But I wasn't sure what the overall impact of this interchange had been. And I'll tell you a story that happened about a week later that gave me tremendous encouragement that I was doing something right in this case. I was back there again. I was seeing her 2 or 3 times a week. I would just go down and walk with her on the grounds of Marlborough. And this day it was early in the morning, 9 or 10 o'clock. And we're walking along, and I never knew what to say to her. So I would just say anything that came into my mind at all. And so this particular day, this is a week or 10 days after this business kind of got resolved, I said, well, Jane, tell me something. What's the most beautiful thing you've seen on this gorgeous morning we're sharing as we walk down the place and the little brooks and ponds and stuff like that? Well, I said the grounds of Marlborough were great. People were horrors, but the grounds were great. And she looked at me and she said, I saw an immense gray rock, and growing in the center of this rock was a beautiful little flower. So I just took that in. She said, seen a rock, and somehow in the very center of this rock there was a flower growing. I didn't interpret to her what I thought this might mean, but I'm just going to tell you, like people say things to me, I just let them go in and I wait to see what my thoughts are, and I pray that my thoughts will go toward the meaning of the thing might have to them. And my thought was, this is a tremendously hopeful sign that there's a flower growing at the center of a cold gray rock. I'll tell you one more thing about her. She had been subject to terrible feelings. This is why she was like Anna. She's a very similar young woman. And she had been subject to terrible feelings of inner deadness, like just limitless death inside her own soul. And she had, also like Anna, had had a pattern of cutting herself and slicing herself and hitting herself and doing other things to feel the pain, feel the sensations of life, to see the blood and all that. She had done this kind of thing too, only a few months before. So I thought that the idea that there's this cold gray rock might be a symbol of the inner deadness that she had been suffering with. But if there's a flower growing in the middle of it, that means there's life in the midst of death. Maybe this life that appears in the midst of death is related then to the connection that we had formed and deepened around this business of the assassins and so on. So I just thought this is a really good sign. I didn't say it's a good sign. I just said, well, thank you for telling me that. And she and I sat down next to a pond, and I remember this vividly, and I'm back doing time travel now in my mind. The sun is shining. It's 10:30 in the morning. We're sitting on a little bench next to the pond. There's frogs and lilies and stuff there. And we composed a poem together, a joint authored poem about that flower at the center of that rock. And she gave the poem a title. The title was The Midnight Blue Rose. She chose that as the color and the title of the poem. And I have that poem floating around somewhere at home in the midst of all my McDonald's bags and other things that I have piled up there. All right, I need to go back and look at that again and see what it is. It wasn't terribly notable, the poem. It was just a beautiful poem about a beautiful flower that somehow or other was growing at the center of a cold gray rock. That little story I just told you is a moment, belongs to a series of moments early in her therapy, but I continued to work with this woman for decades, actually, and she did really, really well. But it was tough going in the very beginning. But what's the point of the whole story that I'm telling you? It's, again, this idea of looking at things in terms for symbols of subjective truth, responding on the basis of what's true and what you hear, as opposed to becoming hypnotized by how it deviates from what you might consider to be externally real. Okay? And generally, what will happen if you perform backhoe therapy in what other form, produce the factual, objective evidence that contradicts the so-called delusion the person is having, you're going to destroy the person. Basically, it's obvious that that is true. You can't do anything with you have to find a way to perceive the truth, and sometimes if you do, then you have another way to respond, because you can perhaps validate what the person is saying. You can say, yes, I do believe you. See, the story I just told you is the same one in a different case, different therapist. as the one I told you. I've forgotten what name I gave to the patient, Marie maybe or something. My colleague who had the patient who believed that the men who were tossing keys and persecuting her, and they're pumping gas into her house and all this, trying to murder her. And do you believe me? It was the Cartesian crunch again. And in her story too, the third way out is to perceive the subjective truth and then respond accordingly in a validating manner. So you're not agreeing to the objective truth of it. You're not locked into that level of it at all. Okay? Why is this such a rare thing? Because of that great boulder of the doctrine of reality with a capital R. The whole psychiatric community is wrapped up in that darn thing. And it needs to supersede that, obviously. So I have more examples. Let's see which one I want to go to next. Maybe I'll do a short one before I get into a longer involved one here. Another story about another therapist. Again, it's a potential Cartesian crunch. A set of ideas is presented as if they possess ultimate validity. The therapist is in a bind because do you believe it or not believe it, but yet there might be a symbolic truth inside what's being given. And if there is, and one can perceive it, then perhaps a pathway can be found to respond that will be healing, rather than exacerbating the situation, making it much worse. So, this is a story, let's see how I have to, again, put myself back into the mode. This is 20 years ago or something like that this happened. It's a story of a consultation I had rather than any direct clinical work that I did, but I helped the therapist work with a crisis that threatened to destroy the therapy that had been going on for quite some time. So, we have a 30-year-old woman is the patient. She's a multi-millionaire. You might think the possession of millions of dollars would shield you from these psychological catastrophes. It does not. She lived alone and had been working with a therapist for about a year or year and a half. And she'd had multiple psychiatric hospitalizations. She carried the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, or had for many years. She was in more or less in remission, so-called, meaning the overt symptoms had receded and weren't real prominent, so she was able to function living at home. She wasn't able to work. She had no friends. She was very isolated, very lonely. She had a tendency when she was with people to be so sensitive and be so affected by what they would say or do, or what she imagined they were saying or doing, that it would kind of blow her away. So she had to isolate herself to get away from such reactions. But she was very lonely. And so the therapist had been working with this young woman, 30-year-old woman, for a number of months, encouraging her to increase, to join organizations or groups or go hiking or something, to increase her social life a little bit more. But there had been great difficulty because, as I said, the patient was very reactive and sort of hypersensitive to the slightest little things that would go on, and would feel very overwhelmed and insulted and intruded upon. So it was kind of a battle between the patient's need to isolate herself and the therapist's active encouragement to join a group and get with people anyway. So that's a little bit the setting. One fine evening, the patient called the therapist and said something really wonderful had happened. And the therapist said, "What's that?" Well, some new neighbors had appeared across the street from her. She had a gorgeous, huge mansion-like house. She lived alone in it for millions of dollars. And some people had bought a house across the street, a young couple. And the couple had come over and introduced themselves. And she had given them the patient had cooked some cookies and gave them the cookies, and then they invited her over to their house for a barbecue. And so she'd gone over to the barbecue there, just she and the husband and wife there, and they had their barbecued steak or whatever it was that they were making, and had a really pleasant, nice evening, an hour or two, drank a glass of wine, and she went home. And she's calling her therapist saying, this wonderful thing. The therapist was overjoyed, because this is exactly the kind of social contact that had been missing. And so she thought the patient was making progress along the lines of coming out of her isolation, beginning to relate to other people more, and maybe it would be part of the healing journey for this person. Not so fast, Okay, so they hung up. The therapist is in a real good mood, gets another call about 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. The bottom had fallen out. The patient had, this is a very similar story to the one I told you before, a very different patient, but you hear this kind of thing again and again. The patient had been going about her business in her house, getting ready to go to bed. She thought she smelled something that she didn't like some kind of foul, sort of sour odor or something. But she didn't know what it was. And she was sniffing and sniffing, and then she thought she was imagining it. But then it got stronger. Then she was imagining it. So back and forth and back and forth. And she said, "What the heck could this be?" Then she thought maybe the electrical system, the wires were melting or something, and it was this, she was touching the walls and seeing if there was any hot spots there where there might be a short in the circuitry that would be causing this, and the plastic would be burning or something. She couldn't find anything like that. Smelling again. Then she noticed her front window was slightly open. And then it came to her what it must be. It came in the form of just a set of images that just appeared out of nowhere. There's a gas, a poisonous gas that is wafting across the street from the house of the people that she had just gone to see. And it's coming into her house, and it's penetrating the house and poisoning her. And what is this gas? She said they must be photographers. And she formed an image in her mind that she saw in their basement. She had not been in their basement, but she saw in her imagination like big trays of photographic chemicals with negatives in there, but developing and so on. And she imagined that there would be a kind of breeze that would waft across the surface of the chemicals as they were developing the film, and it was coming out across the street and going into her house. And it was poisoning her because these chemicals are toxic. And she had all kind of respiratory problems anyway. And so what she had done is gone across the street and sort of almost beat the door down, screaming, cursing, yelling. They came to the door. "You bastards, you motherfuckers." I'm sorry, guys, I'm apologizing. That's what she was like. And they said, what? The photography, the chemicals, the chemicals and the gases and the wafting and all that. They didn't know what she was talking about. From their point of view and their reality, they were not photographers. They did not think of themselves as being photographers. There was nothing in the basement in their reality, but this patient, it was a miracle she didn't end up in jail or in a mental hospital right then and there. Somehow she managed to go home. The therapist called me after that. "What are we going to do with this patient?" She's destroying her progress. "I've worked so carefully and patiently with her," said the therapist to me. And she's been making steps further, and she made friends with these people, but now her illness is making her destroy her own progress. She has to will to destroy herself. Is that what it is, George? How do you work with this? And I did not believe there's such a thing as a will to destroy yourself. I thought, I don't think so. I think something's caused this. This whole event has a context. It has a meaning. It's related to something that happened, but we haven't figured out what it is. So I told the therapist, we need to sort out what really happened. I want you to sit down with your patient and review carefully, in detail, what happened the day before, maybe the 2 days before this whole incident, because something's occurred that's the context for this and is related to its meaning. And I said, I don't know what it is, but I don't think people just get paranoid like this for no reason. Something's occurred, and this is a symbol of it. I'm searching for it. So the therapist went back to the patient and did as I had asked, and had her review what had taken place the day before this incident with the people across the street. And what had happened was the following. There had been a visit. This story is hard to tell because there's so many details that I'll just give you little bits and pieces of, and I'm praying that the thing holds together for you. There had been a visit the day before, like 6 or 7 hours before the barbecue that she had gone to, and everything had gone really well until later these poisonous chemicals had come in that nobody else could verify were there, but she was certainly were there. There had been a visit by her 2 older sisters. Now I have to give you a little bit of family background on this patient. She came from a millionaire family, 3 children, 3 sisters. She was the youngest of the 3. She was always known as kind of the dysfunctional one, the mentally ill one, the hypersensitive, oversensitive one, the one that couldn't really handle life very well. That was kind of her reputation in the family, and she had had multiple hospitalizations that seemed to confirmed that, and everybody had great sympathy for her, but there was something horrible about being kind of the identified sick one, the poor one, the weak one, the limited one. That was part of her identity she'd grown up with. Her mother was completely unavailable to her. Her father was massively narcissistic and destructive. There was only one person that she had really trusted and loved all through her childhood. It was the family gardener, a guy named Jamie. And so that was the one person she would work with him and help him with maintaining the grounds on their immense property and all this kind of thing. There was only one little problem. Jamie sexually abused her extensively. He was her friend. He was a beloved object to her, but he also was sexually a child molester and just went after her in not sadistic ways, gentle ways, insidious ways. So the whole background was just terrible. Full of trauma, full of disaster, full of failure. All the effort she had made to go to school, to get together with people, had all ended in one or another kind of catastrophe. Anyway, so the sisters had come over that day, and so the therapist got an account of what happened in the conversation with the sisters. And the conversation had gone like this: that the patient, we'll call her Jackie, had an idea for a new career for herself. This is the woman I'm talking about, the patient I'm talking about. Okay, the sisters are visiting. And her new idea for a career for her working, she hadn't been working at all for years, was to become a kind of video editor where she would make herself available to families that had lots and lots of videotape of their children in various settings, and then take all the mini tapes or discs or whatever that was recorded on and edit them, integrate them, put music on them, and kind of make master copies of wonderful family records like that. And that was a good idea, and at the time there wasn't anybody really doing this very much. So she told her sisters that that was what she was hoping to do. And her two sisters had responded in the following way, and she was able to give an account of this to her therapist. That's a good idea. Ooh, that's such a good idea. And then they would turn to each other and say, isn't that a good idea? That sounds like that might actually work. We're so happy for you. We like very much. And the problem was the responses, they had these weird tones in their voice, like, it's so good, you're doing so well to have this idea. That might actually work. And then Mabel would look at Griselda and say, isn't that really wonderful? Yes, that's wonderful. It's wonderful. Oh, we want to encourage you, and it's exciting. Ooh, so good. So the patient's listening to this, good. And she's just taking it in, listening to the surface of it. It's encouraging, it's nice, it's positive, right? But is it really? What is really being said there? So as the therapist and the patient explored the meaning and the implications and the repercussions of the tones of voice used by the sisters in offering their encouragement, it emerged more and more that it was kind of weirdly condescending. It was like weirdly diminishing, that it's like, so good. It's kind of like the hidden messages, like, you poor pathetic thing, you've never been able to do a damn thing with your life, you finally got an idea that makes some sense or whatever. We want to encourage you. Okay? And as they talked about that, the therapist and the patient, the tones of voice of the sisters, the patient began to get angry at her sisters and wished then that she would have spotted what was happening in the kind of interaction, the transaction that was taking place there, and been able to yell at them. And she got really angry and furious and raging and wanted to call them up. But as her fury and rage emerged at the condescending tones that were implicit in the way that they responded, guess what happened to the whole thing about the persecution? It vanished. It just disappeared without a trace. So the idea that we arrived at, the therapist and I, was that the tones of voice of the sisters had sort of confirmed and reinforced and dramatized again her identity as a sick one, and had kind of subtly undercut her confidence in herself and penetrated her feeling of goodness about her own self. But she hadn't noticed that that was happening. It had gone in and had been kind of working its way through her. And then later on that evening, and the idea that there are these chemicals coming across from developing photographic film that was a concrete, symbolic representation of the infiltrating power of the diminishing, devaluing, disparaging tones of the sisters. That was kind of the idea. And when you saw what happened, it was perfect, because as the rage emerged, the other thing disappeared. And so you could say this, that if she had spotted this when in the moment of its occurring, if the sisters had talked that way to her, if she would have been able to see the implicit condescension, she could have said, knock off those tones, you're pissing me off, you're making me feel like I'm still the sick one, I'm not the sick one. If she'd been able to say that, there would have been no need for the paranoia to take over, because it wouldn't have penetrated her. She would have kind of caught it in the whole, at its inception. So again, it's the same kind of an idea. A further thought about this. Why photographic film? It has to do with images. Like if there's an image somebody has, it's developing. And the idea that the poisonous fumes of the development it's a little bit hard to explain. It's not exactly logical. It's like an emotional pattern that is being followed here. But she was victim of being seen in a certain way. If other people had certain images of her, she would feel invaded, intruded upon, and annihilated by the images people would have, especially the image of herself as the sick one, the poor one, the weak one, the ill one in her family. Okay, so I could tell you more stories about her, but she had a repeating theme of being victimized by images. Like one of the things I'll just mention this, I'll just touch it without going deeply into it, but she would sometimes sit in her backyard and masturbate. Like just be out there in her bathing suit and just, why not masturbate a little bit? Why not? Go for it. Okay, but sometimes she would see like flashes of light in the distance or something, and then it occurred to her somebody was filming her doing this. And then it occurred to her that somebody's passing around videotape of her masturbating, and it's all through the community. And she had a whole other paranoid crisis around that. And it's the same kind of thing, because as far as anyone knows, there were no, from my reality or yours or anybody else's, there were no videotapes there. But from hers, there were people who had an image of her at her most private moment, and it was a terribly disparaging thing people could mock on and do all this kind of negative reaction to, and then she'd be taken over by that and then go crazy, banging on doors, trying to get the videotapes back. Same kind of thing. And it would have been related to something similar before. I don't even know what the other details would be. I'm interested in this. I've had many patients. I'm not going to tell you any more stories right now about it, but I've had not many, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 patients who get this idea that somebody's taken a picture of them and they're passing that around, or a videotape of them. A young man of my acquaintance beat up, he sort of went postal one day. He was a mailman worker, and he beat up all the people in the post office because he thought they had pictures of him masturbating. Because he's another one out in the backyard whacking off. And he's seeing some flashes of light, so he thought they had all that. So, but it was the same kind of thing, like where your hold on who you are and your self-respect and your self-esteem is very, very precarious. And then if somebody else has an image of you, it's different than that. You feel taken over by that image. And sometimes that image becomes concretely symbolized into a videotape or an actual photograph that then you imagine people are passing around. So it's interesting. But it has to do with ontological insecurity again. The difficulty holding on to a sense of self in the face of the perception of the other. This would be a Langian view of that kind of thing. Okay? Let me do the beginning of another story. So I'm giving you story after story after story where you have these wild, extravagant images that seem so crazy and seem so out of line with what we think is true, but they contain deep, profound, emotional truths, subjective truths. And if we can understand what those are, you find a pathway to respond to them that can make all the difference in the world. I'm going to just give you an introduction on one of the most famous cases of all history. That of Daniel Paul Schreiber, who wrote a book that was published in 1911 and was famously analyzed by Sigmund Freud. I'll talk